Japanese gardens have many characteristics that are what we call essential elements. There are different terms, Japanese terms, to identify these elements, one of which is the crane-shaped pools. It's called horai, and it's a symbol of eternal life. The crane-shaped pools are also characterized by tortoise-shaped islands. There's nothing symmetrical about a Japanese garden. You don't want to have the Persian type, for instance, pools, rectangular, no formal aspect to a Japanese garden whatsoever. We usually use dwarf and Japanese plants. Now the shiku, bai are characterized by pine, bamboo, shiku, which we don't see in this garden, and bai being the flowering plum. We see a lot of flowering cherries, which will stand in, or other flowering trees, Japanese of course, for the flowering plum, which we will probably see here in the distance. It's characterized by the dark purple. Now, there is a feeling that you get, and I have to sit down to make that connection, called Jungen. It's the repose of the spirit in the Japanese garden. Now that's takes some skill, but if you have these elements, in all probability, you're going to be able to render that feeling. Here we see a flowering plum in the distance and a flowering cherry, and the planted path, which is roji, which is another characteristic of the Japanese garden. Also, they have a term wu, which is the borrowed perspective. Here we're seeing a merry-go-round in the distance. Also, there is the cropping of rocks. Here we see a robin's nest spruce on top of one of the rocks. There's usually 15 boulders or rocks in a Japanese garden, one of which is Shibisen, which is the rock center of the universe. Japanese yews are used rather than English yews. Here we see a good-sized Japanese. Now, they're all planted as dwarf plants, but of course they'll get good size. Now, the Japanese garden here at Rogers Park was planted in 2 stages. This is the older stage and has less of the flowering trees that we characterize as the flowering plum, the bai. Here we see some golden foliifera. Also, you notice the terrain is not level. That's another characteristic of the little bird here, of the Japanese gardens. Some golden foliifera, which was planted years and years ago. It's gotten quite tall since, but use dwarf plants. The pines usually are white pine because of the lack of symmetry, which is important. Here we see the Shibisen, the rock center of the universe. That's one of the symbols. It's one of the 15 boulders that you would have in a good-sized, large Japanese garden. Now, if you're going to have a small Japanese garden, I would recommend to use a Zen garden with more abstract pools and trees and the like.